which in the last years has increasingly absorbed the attention, because indeed politicians like Viktor Orban in Hungary or Jarosław Kaczyński in Poland have successfully created the impression that a very rude form of the re-emergence of nationalism is taking part in these countries. What I would like to do is to differentiate a little bit and to talk basically about a triangle which we are observing, the interplay of a triangle of factors of the re-emergence of the concept of nation in this part of Europe, and its intertwinedness with the question of the state sovereignty on the one hand, and on the other hand, the quest for a specific path to modernity, which you could call retro-modernization, or which I have often called neo-traditionalist modernization. I will try to shed a little bit light on the developments in this part of Europe by pointing at four questions, debating four questions. First one, what are the particularities and the idiosyncrasies of the nation in this part of the continent? Second, why can we observe this re-emerging relevance of the nation in the last years? Because after 1989, these countries regained independence, de facto independence. They were not so much emphasizing, the governments there, the majority of the mainstream society, they were not so much emphasizing their national identity, for example. And then I would like to debate a little bit what the main domestic dynamics are in these countries, and I always simplify a little bit, because talking about Central Eastern Europe means talking about a very heterogeneous group of countries which have very different pathways in history, and very fundamentally diverging societal, economic, and cultural parameters, of course. And finally, I would like to reflect a little bit upon, and as you mentioned, I'm a think tank person working on European affairs, what the implications for the European Union of these developments are. Now, first, a couple of impressions and observations on the particularities of the nation for these countries. I think we have to bear in mind, talking about Central Eastern Europe, that for a long time the nations there were in a very specific situation of being peripheries on the one hand, but on the other hand of being positioned in between. The German word which is sometimes used for this part of the continent is zwischen Europa, in between Europe. These countries, see it probably most dramatically with Poland, but not only, have a formidable geopolitical handicap, because they were sandwiched between the great powers, especially Russia, Germany on the one hand, Russia on the other side, which meant that, for example, Poland did not exist on the political map of Europe for 123 years. And that's one of the reasons why this year, 2018, in almost all of the countries stretching from the north, from the eastern part of the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea region, except for Hungary, they are celebrating 100 years of gaining or regaining independence and statehood. Not Hungary, because as we know, this was a loser of the Versailles or the Paris the treaties ending the First World War. This kind of geopolitical position went along with a couple of cultural, civilizational specificities. So Middle Europa, its eastern part, coming from the assumption that Germany also is Middle Europa, the eastern part of Central Europe, on the one hand, has always identified itself as part of the Western Christianity, as having, as in the case of Poland, to some extent in Hungary, the role of an anti-morale Christianitatis, the bulwark of Western Christianity against the East, against the Tatars, against the Turks. And at the same time, emphasizing, that's what we see at least in Poland, is Romanitas. It's very interesting to say this at the very beginning, that this in-between situation, cultural terms, is fuzzy. We have in Poland a debate now where some of the conservatives are arguing Poland, of course, is not a country of the East. Poland is also, and that was a debate which emerged after the financial and sovereign debt crisis. Many said Poland, the Baltic states, are countries not of the East but of the North, because they have a similar approach to financial stability like the Scandinavian or Germany. Poland, of course, is a country of the West in geopolitical terms now, belonging to NATO, but they say Poland is a country of Europe South because of its Latinitas as a Catholic country. So you see, we have a quite vague situation which is open to interpretations. We have in that region, part of that region, the tradition of the German way of organizing cities in the Middle Ages. We have traditions of the Hanse parts of the region, and even part of the German minorities having been there present quite vividly for centuries. The islands of the Reformation and Lutheranism, Hungary or in Slovakia, for example. On the other hand, in spite of this Western civilizational nucleus, there are also overlaps with Eastern identity, because parts of the region have belonged to the Russian Empire, parts of the region have belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and of course important processes which took part in Western Europe, industrialization in the 19th century, like the emergence of the strong middle classes, part from the Czech Republic, parts of Hungary, that did not happen in a way we know it from the western part of the continent. So this creates a sort of steady tension. If you look a little bit further to the southeast, it's interesting for me to see this in Romania. Romania, which is not Central Europe, southeastern Europe, but which also said we are, in a way, on the one hand, we're an Orthodox country, but of course we belong to the West. Romania changed its alphabet in, I think, 1860 from Cyrillica to the Latin alphabet as a political show of the part of this country and the society's part of the West. What we should not forget is, of course, the societal and economic aspect. There is a historically grown gap of economic development between Western Central Europe, the western part of Central Europe, and Eastern Central Europe, which was, of course, reinforced by the period after World War II. Last factor I would like to mention in this context, there is a structural problem with the state in this part of Europe. The state either did not exist at all, or it was something alien, it was occupied, and even if these countries had a form of statehood, like after 1945, they were part of the Soviet Empire, so again, it was a sort of de facto limitation of sovereignty. And then, and that's what we have been seeing, witnessing after 1989, the states did not work optimally, to be neutral, or in a technocratic way. There were substantial, there still are, substantial governance problems, corruption, and so on and so forth. So there is a need for reconstructing, renewing the state. If we put this together, I would say the countries, the nations in this Zwischen-Europa, in between Europe, they have been for long times rather policy takers. There is a well-known book about Poland by the British historian Norman Davis, and the title of the book is God's Own Playground. It's about Poland's history. So the attempt to change over from being a policy taker to being a policy maker in the European context is the overarching strategic aim of all countries. Now, 1918, 100 years ago, I would say means for these countries, of course, regaining or gaining independence, but at the same time, it means embodies 1918 and what happened afterwards, embodies the broken promise of the 20th century for these countries, because their independence failed in 1939 or 1945. So what was supposed to become an era of normalization turned out to be a lost century. And only in 1989 or 2004-7, when they joined the European Union, they again were at this point where they were supposed to be in 1980. Now, these are some of the broader background factors. You could enlarge that list, but that'd be sufficient for the beginning. The second point is the nation in the notion of the nation in Central Eastern Europe and the understanding. Here I would say we have the impression now that we have a very ethnicist understanding of the nation in these countries. It's true that the debates beginning in the 19th century were very much inspired, I think, by the German model, a romantic ideal of the nation, one which is very close to the Kulturnation. On the other hand, what we should not forget is that looking a little bit broader and further back to history, we see that we have strong, let's call it pluralistic understandings of nation. So the Polish-Lithuanian Rzeczpospolita, this republic, the first republic in the medieval until the end of the 18th century, was an example for a sort of constructive coexistence of different nations. One of the buzzwords at that time, which Poles like very often to quote, even today, is that this Genker tenus natione Polonus, so a noble man from what is today in Belarus identified himself as belonging to the nation of the Polish nobility, irrespective of if you're Lithuanian, Belarusian, or Polish origin. You were part of this republic in a way. Also, the Second Republic of Poland in the interwar period, basically established by Piłsudski, was a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, multi-denominational state, where you had 1/3 of representatives of national minorities being part of that nation: Jews, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Germans and others. So I think we have these traditions not only in the Polish-Lithuanian but also in other parts of the region. Think about the concept of Bohemia, lands of the Czech crown, where you had a sort of, not always easy, but a sort of coexistence between Germans, ethnic Czechs, and Jews, for example. Now, 1939, and of course it was Germany's catastrophic contribution, 1939, and then 1945 on the Yalta Order, and the imposition of Soviet communism, meant the beginning of an era of homogenization. So we had the annihilation through the Holocaust of the Jewish communities, we had the expulsion of Germans from that part, and a sort of communist totalitarian nationalism, which served as an instrument to legitimize the new autocratic systems. Again, we see it interestingly in Poland, where the model of a state and of a nation was realized after World War II, which was the model which Piłsudski's opponents wanted to reach, Polak Katolik, Poland as a Catholic national homogeneous state, more to the west. This exactly happened with the fact that Poland was moved to the west. Now, 1989, and the nation in these countries, the overarching narrative in all countries was that of the return to the West, becoming politically, this meant becoming part of NATO and of the European Union, and most of the countries accepted the entrance to a community which, at that time at least, was based on ideas of being a post-national, post-Westphalian entity predominantly. And what went on in all countries after 1989 was a multi-dimensional process of profound transformation. These countries, the economies, the societies, the political systems underwent fundamental change, but it was an asymmetric change. These countries wanted to become like the West, they wanted to join the European Union, so they had to accept the models which the economists from Western Europe or from the IMF proposed. They had to adopt the EU legal system. There was no debate because we have this overarching strategic objective. There was a sort of permissive consensus in the public, but this changed after the countries joined the European Union. Quite after some time, but quite considerably. What we see in the last years can be explained in the categories of a German sociologist, Tönnies, who distinguishes between two ways how political and societal entities are organized: Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft, community or society. A community is based on emotional bonds and common values. Gesellschaft, society, is more zweckrational, a rational utilitarian way of doing it together. The processes in Central Europe after 1989 were very much about Gesellschaft, very much about technocratic reform programs. And now we have a return of community thinking, traditional family, neighborhoods, communities, and of course the nation as the main way to integrate societies. So you could call it the nation is a community around the warm campfire of shared memory and togetherness of values. This is the counter model to the cold and technocratic process of reforms these countries and the societies went through after 1989. Now, my third question, or my third aspect I would go into is this is sort of a hypothesis. I would say this re-emergence of the nation, and this rediscovery of the nation, is an important driver, but it's not the most important one. It's not the key element of the political reorientation which is going on over there. What we have in a nutshell is a quest for political and cultural sovereignism, which manifests itself in 4 dimensions. The first one is what I mentioned at the beginning. That's what is going on in Hungary and in Poland, neo-traditionalism. If you read the debates in the last decade or so of conservative think tanks, conservative intellectuals in these countries, there is a strong narrative. We want to break with the paradigm of imitating modernization. We do not want to do the copy and paste of the West. We want to modernize our countries, but in a very specific way. That we quote Dariusz Karłowicz, a Polish conservative philosopher. So let's learn public finance from the Germans. Let's learn state institutions from the French, party system from the British, and self-organization from the Americans. But the language of culture and politics is something we should learn from our dead ancestors. That's quite emblematic, I would say. This new sort of identity politics, and what I see very clearly in Poland now is a narrative about decolonialization. That was our elites, the liberal elites, were in an asymmetric situation vis-à-vis the West, and we should overcome that. And we should question the liberal universalism of the West. I think that's very key. So they don't want to leave the European Union, but they want to live their model in the EU. Second, and I will try to be brief, the second element of this political and cultural sovereignism is, we call it defensive statism. It comes, for example, when you say security. In all the countries, you have a very explicit threat perception. It has something to do with Russia, but not totally. So they have discovered that there is a problem with the effectiveness of the state, and it's no accident. Kaczynski in Poland, the core of his reforms is the judiciary, is the state apparatus of the political administrative system. Third aspect, which plays a role here, is a new reading of values. All these countries and their governments share the same values as Western European countries. They're in favor of liberty, they're in favor of solidarity, but they have another understanding. For example, with liberty, Viktor Orban, in his speech during the anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 in 2016, October, he said, yes, we need, as Hungarians, we need liberty, but the liberty and sovereignty of the nation is the precondition for the individual liberties. So we have a divergence between West and East, between the collective understanding of liberty and the individual understanding. Fourth and last aspect, we have a very specific way of understanding democracy, at least in many of the countries, where majoritarian democracy and the legitimacy you have through majorities is in the core of the political debate. So that's Orban and Kaczynski. We have a supermajority, or at least an absolute majority. That gives us the mandate to not only do reforms, but to rearrange, for example, the constitutional system. It is a sort of related system transformation of 1989. Last point, I conclude. What are the implications for the European Union of these processes? It's not dramatic, but it's relevant. Again, for brief points, what we see for the first time, we have a coexistence of divergent value systems. Yes, it is true that liberal versus conservative, to simplify, dichotomy is also emerging in the UK, in Germany, in France, between the urban centers and the rural peripheries. But in these countries, this is basically the mainstream in many respects. So the multiple modernities an old concept we know from different parts of the world. We attempt to go the own way, to have a strong modern country, strong modern economy, but to combine this with traditional values now has arrived to the European Union. Second, neither Viktor Orban nor Jarosław Kaczynski are anti-European. What they want is a sort of polycentric Europe. If you want to focus in a traditional way, Europe of our lands. And in many respects, I would be a little bit provocative. I would say Orban and Kaczynski are more pro-European than Macron when it comes to the strengthening of the single market, for example. Macron says we don't want to have social dumping. That's what is read in the Czech Republic or in Poland as a sort of protectionism. Third aspect, polarization in these countries is the dominating way of organizing politics, doing politics at the domestic level. They try to export this antagonistic way of doing politics on the European level. This is indeed a problem because the EU can only function as a community which goes for compromise. Compromise is not, increasingly in these countries, not seen as a success, but as a defeat. And very last point, that's a soft one with hard implications. In these countries, and in this respect, there may be pioneers, see a growing emotionalization of political debates. Dominique Moisy, a French political scientist, wrote a book some time ago about the geopolitics of emotions. He said he simplifies, but it's interesting in a way. So there are three huge cultures in the world, and they are attached to certain guiding emotions. So Asia is hope, the Arab world is humiliation, and the West is fear. In my opinion, Central Eastern Europe is a combination of all of it. It's a melting pot of all of that, but it's highly emotionalized. Just very last example, one of the key words of Kaczynski in Poland is polityka godności, the politics of dignity. Through the introduction of allowances for families with kids, 500 zloty, if you have 2 or more children, so a social benefit you get from the state. I give, and through other social policy measures, I give back dignity to our individuals, and I also want to give back dignity to the Polish state, for example, by, as he calls it, stopping or ending the politics on the knees vis-a-vis Germany. So we have to be much more assertive in that dignity. Apologies for being so long. I hope I could confuse you.